This is going to be an addition to the video that I made where I was revealing that the Mongolian people are descendants of Magog, which in Hebrew they say Magog. I was talking about Volodymyr Zelensky having grown up in one of the largest Mongolian cities within Ukraine in that video. So I'm going to pick up some of what I said just to start it off so that you'll understand from the beginning where I'm going with this and what's being revealed now. More information that's really interesting. As far as the Russians go, they come from an ancient people called Rus, R-U-S. The word Rosh, on the other hand, is a word for head, like when you say Rosh Hashanah, it's the head of the year. It's also like a chief, a chieftain, or a leader. So Gog would be the leader, and Magog would be his land that he rules over. Having researched this in depth, I do not believe that the Russians are Gog or Magog. I believe that this is a historical evidence that the Mongolians are the descendants of Magog, which are descended from Noah's son Japheth. And they went into various lands and settled there. They were actually a very barbaric people, and they almost completely destroyed Islam I want to get into that a little bit, but then they actually accepted Islam as their religion after they nearly wiped out the Muslims. And they believed that they were the punishment of God against the Muslims, according to what was written in the history books, and that God sent a sword against them because of their sins. So this is not my opinion, what I'm sharing with you. This is historical evidence and facts that I'm sharing with you, and maybe it'll open your eyes to see some more of the history, so this will become clearer about the Gog-Magog war. So I typed in a question in the search box and came up with this answer. It is interesting to note that according to Mongolian tradition, their nation was descended from Magog. The Mongolian Empire once included sections of Russia, China, and North Korea. The Chinese and all the minority groups living in China are of the Mongoloid race, which stems from Noah's son Japheth. So they were invaders, and they came in and they took territories in some of these regions. They fought against the Russians, and they fought against the Muslims, and they were known as being very warlike. Now the name Magog in Hebrew, Magog, and in Arabic, Magog, means land of Gog. Magog means land of Gog, was the second son of Japheth, according to Genesis 10:2. So part of the Ukrainian territory was Mongolian cities, but we also have other people, the names Gog and Magog derivatives, which remained intact after hundreds of years of tribal migrations and territory wars. And today's Armenian and Georgian peoples are not only descended from Magog, but also Magog's nephew, Togarmah. So that's also one of the peoples that comes against Israel in the latter days. Meaning Togarmah is going to be part of the Gog-Magog war going into Israel, including Togarmah, which was Magog's nephew. Now it is said that Magog's brother, Gomer, had 3 sons. Ashkenaz, mentioned previously as father of the Scythians, Kivha, and Togarmah. Togarmah's descendants show up in history as Armenians, Georgians, and some Turkic peoples. We first find them mentioned by the Hittites in the 14th century BC as the Anatolian kingdom of Togarmah. Then later by the Assyrians as a people called Togarmah. After spreading south to Anatolia, Asia Minor, which is present-day Turkey, their better-known tribe, the Phrygians from Armenia, dominated the region and would become the ancestors of peoples in modern-day Turkey. Though many Turks claim to be descendants of Togarmah, they are also descended from Magog, as explained in this below. Now, the Phrygians, that's really interesting because when you learn music, and I was a music student, there are different scales that people play in these different modes. And these different modes have certain, sharps, flats, or whatever, and they're named by different locations of where they originated. So you'll have a scale that is in the Phrygian mode, and you can actually learn the Phrygian mode of music, and this actually is basically from the region where the Armenians were and people of modern-day Turkey. Now we know that Ataturk invaded Armenia and basically took over all of Asia Minor and then renamed it Turkey. So all of that region is now called something else by these Islamic invaders that are descendants from Magog as well. Togarmah, as the father of the Turkish peoples, Jerome, 4th century AD, Roman Catholic priest, theologian, and historian, along with 5th century AD Archbishop Isidore of Seville's Spanish scholar and historian, each regarded Togarmah as the father of the Phrygians. Armenian and Georgian historians claim Togarmah was the founder of their nations along with other Caucasian peoples. Strabo mentions the Armenians as horse breeders, indicating a close relationship with Magog's descendants. Interestingly, these same peoples are listed in Ezekiel 38 as unified with Magog. Again, Magog's descendants appear to have mixed culturally with their descendants of Togarmah, just as they did with Ashkenaz descendants. The name Scythian has been used to refer to various peoples seen as similar to the Scythians, or who lived anywhere in a vast area covering present-day Ukraine, covering Russia and Central Asia, known until medieval times as Scythia. The name was also used among early scholars studying Proto-Indo-Europeans. The tribes of Magog'ians and Scythians would become many of the great confederations of steppe warriors, also mingling with others not of the same race. So let me tell you, the sons of Japheth were Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tyrus in Genesis 10:2. And the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, set your face toward Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh. So he's the chief ruler. Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, O Gog, prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal. So those were the lands. The study of Gog and Magog has long been a challenge to Bible scholars and historians alike. Magog is described in Genesis 10:2 and 1 Chronicles 1:5 as a grandson of Noah. The prophet Ezekiel claims Magog's descendants are from the far north and will someday attack Israel. Throughout history, we find Gog and Magog identified with many place names, as well as numerous tribes and people groups, some firmly leaving their mark on history, including many present-day cultures. The people who descended from Magog, son of Japheth, son of Noah, are not obscure, as some have suggested. Perhaps the most known of Magog's descendants, sometimes referred to as the Magog'ians, are the Scythians. Well, sort of. The Scythians are associated with Magog, but not by genealogy. Scythians are descended from Ashkenaz, for Ashkuz, son of Gomer, son of Japheth, as listed in Genesis chapter 10. Ashkenaz is sometimes mistakenly thought of as the son of Magog, though he was Magog's nephew. The term Scyth is derived from Ashkenaz, appearing in Assyrian records as Ishkuzai, reported as a people pouring in from the north sometime around the beginning of the 7th century BC. One of the earliest references to Magog is thought to come from Assyrian inscriptions in the 9th century BC, referring to the Matgugi, meaning country of the Gugu. There can be no doubt that at their earliest stages, tribes of Magog'S Magog'ians, Scythians, assimilated into one people. Together they made up a part of the early Scythian hordes. In fact, wherever or whenever we find references to Gog and Magog, in name or place we usually find the Scythians. A commonality with the descendants of both Magog and Ashkenaz was their domestication and widespread use of horses, and their reputation as master archers. The Scythians were known specifically as horse-riding nomads, ancient people known as Alans and Sarmatians, not to be confused with the Samaritans, living in the area around the Caspian Sea from about 900 BC, and their tribes were called Scythian. A people known as the Hippe-Molgoi, or Hippo-Molgoi. Hippo is Greek for horse, and Molgoi, presumably a translation of Magog, are mentioned in Homer's Iliad around the beginning of the 9th century BC as Scythian drinkers of mare milk. Not only known for drinking the milk of horses, they are mentioned as equestrian nomads of the northern Russian steppes. Now, this doesn't mean that they were Russians. This means that they were nomads that were, invaders in these lands. These people would later form tribes and ethnic groups we would come to know as familiar names in history: Huns, Turks, Tartars, Mongols, and others. Evidence shows that clans of Scythians were forced to move to more favorable conditions, mostly east and south, due to a changing climate in the steppe. Wherever they went, they often attacked, intermingled with, or simply forced out indigenous peoples. Ancient tribes of Scythians and Magog'ians mixed with other indigenous peoples of the Asian steppe would become the Huns. Hunnic tribes are obscure in origin, though compelling evidence indicates that they were descendants of Magog, a Scytho-Siberian people known by their Altaic lineage and language. These tribes are thought to have arrived in the region around 600 BC, first described in the 3rd century BC by Chinese sources as a controlling empire of the Hangshunu or Xiongnu or Xiongnu Asian Empire to the north, Mongolia. They were considered barbarians to be feared, as their horseback lifestyle proved very efficient for rapid invasion and raiding villages and townships. As noted earlier, scholars postulate that the Great Wall of China, begun in the 5th century BC, may have been built to keep these Hunnic hordes at bay. The Arabic name for the Wall of China, the Great Wall of China, was the Wall of Al-Magog, meant to keep out the invading armies of Magog. So that was the purpose of the Great Wall of China. After intermingling with native Asian people groups, they would eventually form a nomadic coalition of warrior tribes who spoke a Hunnish language. The Huns went on the move, eventually attacking western Scythians about 170 BC, slowing dominating Scythian lands. They also warred with the Han dynasty, beginning in the middle of the 2nd century BC, taking territory deep into China, reported as formidable enemies, a wild people of the mountains by the Chinese. Eventually, the Xiongnu would split into the north and south, and the south formed a weak alliance with the Chinese Han, who later would be known simply as the Chinese. The North Xiongnu, or Hungnu, would become the Huns we know in history, giving us Attila. They traveled west, attempting to maintain themselves on the Caspian steppes, the areas north of the Caspian Sea. By 200 AD, the Romans first became aware of the Huns, as written by Pliny, a Roman author, philosopher, and geographer, who described them arriving in the region as mounted horse archers. Magog's descendants formed a branch of the Eastern Asiatic Scythians. In 584 BC, they were finally driven out of Anatolia and sent back to the areas north of the Caucasus. When residing in the Middle East in the early centuries after the flood, Magog was closely identified with Mushki, which is Meshech, and Tabali, or Tubal, and moved in Asia in advance of them. The name Mongol appears to be directly derived from the name Magog. For example, in India, Mongol became Mongol, and a large part of China was known as Mengi when Europeans first visited it. The Arabs called the Scythian tribes of Tartary Yejuj and Mejuj. And Gog and Magog, the Great Wall of China, as the Wall of Magog. In the 13th century AD, Marco Polo, the Venetian traveler to the Orient, knew that the Mongols were descendants of Magog. He further understood the names of Ung and Mungu in China to be Gog and Magog. The descendants of Magog migrated via southern Russia to their current homeland, leaving behind such place names as Mongolistan, Mugodezjar, the Magog'S Hills, and Mogotau Mountains. Among the people of Mongolia, Inner Mongolia, Central, and much of northern and southern China, Korea, and Japan are descendants from Magog. There are just over 1 billion people in China today. It's no wonder that the name of their ancestor Japheth means expansion, implying a large or expanding race of people. Other peoples descended from Magog include the Aleuts and Inuits, and their faces are similar to the Chinese, and the Samoyeds or Netsi, who, although having adopted a Finnic language, are Mongoloid by race. It says many American Indians also descend from Magog. We also find the Mogs, the town of Magog in Mogadok Mountain, the Mogog River in Myanmar, Burma, and a tribe known as the Magars in Nepal. In the 5th to 3rd centuries BC, northern China was divided into several separate kingdoms, constantly battling for supremacy. The Qin controlled the western parts, and this may be the origin of the name China. This dynasty was successful in unifying almost all of China by 221 BC. The impact of marauding Mongols restored power to the Han dynasty, which stayed in power until 220 AD, and after the end of the dynasty, 3 kingdoms arose. The most northerly found itself exposed to the aggression of the Turkics and others. In the 6th century, the Sui reunited China, and the Great Wall was reconstructed. About 400 years later, the Sung dynasty took over almost all of China with the exception of the north, which fell to Genghis Khan in the 13th century, who had managed to unite the various Mongolian, Turkic, Tatar, Uyghur, and Kyrgyz tribes under his leadership. His hordes conquered the Indus region, the Euphrates region, the Caucasus, and the Black Sea lands. In 1233 AD, he conquered Russian troops and moved relentlessly westwards. Various descendants of his attempted to conquer all of Europe, but failed due to the sudden death of their leader in 2 cases. However, it was left to his grandson, Kublai Khan, to conquer most of China and to establish a Mongol dynasty with its capital at Beijing. Under the Mongols, 4 classes were established: the Mongol elite, Turkic peoples and other Mongols, the northern Han Chinese, and the southern Chinese, who were regarded as barbarians. Over 300 years later, the Ming successfully organized a rebellion against the Mongol rulers and drove them out, establishing their capital at Nanking and later returning it to Beijing. They were in turn overthrown by the Qing dynasty, which originated in Manchuria. Today, China has just over 1.3 billion people, yet according to a census of China about 1 AD, comprising almost all of the area which is today still known as China, she had 60 million inhabitants, although it is thought that this figure may have been underestimated as there were advantages in not being counted. China, although inhabited in the main by descendants of Magog, also includes some of the descendants of Gomer and Javan. What I'm about to read to you is some more of their history and some of their conquering warlike strategies. It's from sacredfootsteps.org. Nomadic warriors, sophisticated weaponry, and brutal tactics. This moderately sums up what the Mongol Empire is widely known for. Their reputation as merciless fighters who ravaged Muslim lands, leveling entire cities and leaving nothing but death and destruction in their wake, perhaps makes their later conversion to Islam appear somewhat surprising. So, you had Genghis Khan was one of the big rulers of the Mongols and these invading forces. So they came in and they were just merciless to all these people and burned down their villages and put people to the sword. And it's very interesting what he had to say was the reason why he did this, because he felt like that he was being used of God to punish those people for their sins against God. So this goes on to say nomadic conquerors. Genghis Khan, son of the Mongol chieftain, so that would be Gog, was unstoppable even at a young age. He laid the foundations of the largest continuous empire in history by defeating influential Mongol leaders and uniting the nomadic tribes of Northeast Asia. Not only did he conquer vast territory, but he also proved to be one of the greatest leaders the world has ever known. Though their reputation implies a sort of unchecked barbarism, the Mongol warriors were true geniuses when it came to military strategy. This was a key factor in their success in conquering vast lands, including the Muslim empires of the day. The Mongols moved through the Muslim world, destroying numerous cities in their wake and dismantling 4 prominent Muslim dynasties in just 40 years. The Khwarramshahs, the Seljuks, the Ayyubids, and the Abbasids. The Mongol forays into Muslim territory began with the initial campaigns of Genghis Khan and his son in northeastern Iran between 1219 and 1222, when they reduced many of the most prosperous cities of the region to complete ruins. Now, this is a historical record of these people that are known to be descendants of Magog, and these were conquering, warring, brutal tribes. And this is not, some conjured up idea. This is historical record. While some cities such as Bukhara and Samarkand were granted terms that allowed urban life to continue, others, including Merv and Nishapur, were not so fortunate. In Balkh, in northern Afghanistan as elsewhere, Genghis Khan commanded that the population, both men and women, should be put to the sword. Giovanni, later a court historian for the Mongols, reported that it took survivors 13 days and nights to count all of the corpses following the fall of Merv. They reportedly numbered 1.3 million. Though this number may be inflated, according to David Morgan, Mongol actions in Central Asia were an attempted genocide. And I think it's interesting that, the words in Arabic for Gog and Magog, that is something that they believe with the Quran and everything. They believe Gog and Magog. So they should know, because they were invaded in many of their villages. Even in Bukhara, though not completely massacred, historian Ibn Atir, who visited northeastern Iran in the years before the Mongol invasion, writes, "It was a dreadful day from the count of weeping by the men, women, and children. They were scattered to the four winds and completely torn apart. They divided them, women, among themselves too. Bukhara became a wasteland, collapsed on its roof timbers, as though it had not been thronging with people just the day before." Stories such as these spread far and wide. Tales of their ruthlessness created fear and terror, ensuring that the reputation of the Mongols preceded them. This played a part in the success of their armies, and Genghis Khan himself encouraged it. Ibn Atir records a narrative in which Genghis Khan, upon capturing Bukhara, addresses the crowd. Now get this is incredible. "O people, know that you have committed great sins, and that the great ones among you have committed these sins. If you ask me what proof I have for these words, I say it is because I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." In the audience, a man told his friend who wanted to object, "Be silent. It is the wind of God's omnipotence that blows, and we have no power to speak." Where other conquerors would likely have spared cities in order to enjoy their revenues, the Mongols chose instead to plunder. They had little respect for places of worship, as the following narrative makes clear. The infidels were even taking the minbars and the Quran containers and throwing them in the moat. "Verily we belong to God, and to him do we return. In truth did God call himself patient and forbearing, otherwise the earth would have swallowed them up when they did such a thing." By the time Genghis Khan died in 1227, he had conquered northern China and Iran. Following his death, campaigning resumed in 1236, and Mongol attention was turned towards southern China in the east and Eastern Europe in the west. Now, a lot of this invasion had a name called the Golden Horde, and it has a huge history of all of these marauders, invaders, plunderers in the group of the descendants of Magog. So they were known for just being these warlike barbarians. In 1255, Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, was charged by the new Mongol ruler to destroy all remaining Muslim powers between Iran and the Mediterranean, leading to the Mongol excursions into Syria and Iraq and resulting in the fall of Baghdad in 1258. The destruction of Baghdad remains a pivotal moment in history, a disaster by any standards. The figure of casualties in the city, though somewhat questionable, is estimated by some sources as between 200 and 800,000 people. The figure included the Caliph al-Mustasim himself. Havoc was wreaked upon the City of Peace, and along with it, its libraries containing numerous priceless manuscripts were destroyed, though some have questioned the accuracy of this later claim. This is how the 14th century Persian historian Wasaf described the situation. "They swept through the city like hungry falcons attacking a flight of doves, or like raging wolves attacking sheep, with loose reins and shameless faces, murdering and spreading terror. Beds and cushions made of gold and encrusted with jewels were cut to pieces with knives and torn to shreds. Those hiding behind the veils of the great harem were dragged through the streets and alleys, each of them becoming a plaything as the population died at the hands of the invaders." The Ayyubid capital of Damascus was captured shortly after Baghdad. Only in 1260 did the expansion of the Mongol Empire finally come to an end. Hulagu's army was defeated at the Battle of Ain Jalut by the Bahri Mamluks, led by Sultan Qutuz. By now, fractures had long started to appear within the Mongol Empire and had resulted in the creation of various Mongol states called Khanats, with widening economic and religious differences between them. Juki, son of Genghis Khan, and his succeeding sons were already ruling over the territory known as the Golden Horde, as the western portion of the empire. And while Kublai, the great Khan, focused his attention on consolidating China, Hulagu and his successors in Iran and Russia built the Ilkhanid state. As fate would have it, from the ashes of the caliphate, a new Muslim empire would eventually arise, beginning first with the Khans of the Great Horde, and later through the conversion of the Mongols of Persia, the Ilkhans, to Islam. Berki Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan from his son Juki, is believed to be the earliest Muslim convert among the Mongols. Berki ruled over the Golden Horde for 10 years until his death in 1267. Few sources about his conversion exist, though his courtiers and those closest to him are thought to have converted alongside him and openly displayed their Muslim identity at court. Upon hearing of Luganu's destruction of Baghdad, according to the Persian historian Rashid al-Din Hamadani, who died in 1318, Berki is reported to have said, "He has sacked all the cities of the Muslims, and without consulting his kinsmen has brought about the death of the caliph. With the help of God, I will call him to account for so much innocent blood." Following the Mongol defeat in Anjalut, Berki struck an alliance first with the Mamluk Sultan Qutuz and later Sultan Baybars. In 1262, the armies of Berki and Hulagu faced each other in battle for the first time. That ultimately led to the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire and saw the death of both military leaders in 1265 and 1266 respectively. Some historians believe that Berki's intervention, busying Hulagu and inner Mongolian disputes, prevented him from inflicting the sacred lands of Islam, Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem with the same fate that was suffered by Baghdad. Now, it's interesting to note that the Black Death was responsible for helping to bring down these Mongolian barbarians that were invading everywhere, and the Black Death came upon them and literally almost wiped them out. So it was a plague that completely altered the history from then on. Now, you know what's really interesting to me? It said that the Mongols were known for plundering, and that was basically a characteristic of theirs, of the descendants of Magog. So I find it very interesting to see what it says in Ezekiel 38:13, and just listen to this. This is Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish and all her villages will say to you, "Have you come to take plunder? Have you gathered your hoards?" That's the Golden Horde. "To loot, to carry off silver and gold, and to take away livestock and goods, and to seize much plunder?" And they were the marauders that were known as the plunderers. So they didn't just capture the lands. They were known specifically for that alone, plundering. So now let's take a look. I'm going to stop reading for a minute in that historical record, and I'm going to go to Ezekiel 38, which you know quite well. But I just want you to hear it now that you've heard this history. "And the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I'm against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and I will turn thee back and put hooks into thy jaws, and I will bring thee forth with all thine army, horses and horsemen. Now they were known for their using horses and drinking the milk of horses. All of them clothed with all sorts of armor, even a great army with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. So they were the ones who said that they brought the sword against the Muslims and destroyed the Muslim villages and almost wiped the Muslims out back then in the 1200s. And all of them were handling swords. And then it says Persia, Ethiopia, which is modern-day Sudan, and Libya with them. All of them with shield and helmet. Gomer, okay, that's the relative of Magog. And all his bands, the house of Togarmah, which I explained, of the north quarters, and all of his bands, and many people with thee. Be thou prepared, and prepare for thyself, thou and all thy company that are assembled unto thee, and be thou a guard unto them. After many days thou shalt be visited in the latter years. Thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword, and is gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste, but it is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. Thou shalt ascend and come like a storm. Thou shalt be like a cloud to cover the land, thou and all thy bands, and many people with thee. Thus says the Lord God, it shall also come to pass, that at the same time shall things come into thy mind, and thou shalt think an evil thought, and thou shalt say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. I will go to them that are at rest, and dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls, and having neither bars nor gates, to take a spoil, that's a plunder, and to take prey, and to turn thy hand upon the desolate places that are now inhabited, and upon the people that are gathered out of the nations, which have gotten cattle and goods that dwell in the midst of the land. Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish, and all the young lions thereof shall say unto thee, Art thou come to take spoil, or plunder? Hast thou gathered thy company to take prey, to carry away silver and gold, to take away cattle and goods, to take a great plunder, spoil? Therefore, son of man, prophesy, and say unto Gog, that's the leader, Thus says the Lord God, In that day when my people of Israel dwelleth safely, shalt thou not know it? And thou shalt come from thy place out of the north parts, thou and many people with thee. So that's all the descendants and all the cousins and the brother of Magog that had descendants that were part of this group of the Golden Horde. All of them riding upon horses, a great company and a mighty army. And thou shalt come up against my people of Israel as a cloud to cover the land. It shall be in the latter days, and I will bring thee against my land, that the heathen may know me, when I shall be sanctified in thee, O Gog, before their eyes. Thus saith the Lord God, Art thou he of whom I have spoken in old time by my servants the prophets of Israel, which prophesied in those days many years that I would bring thee against them? And it shall come to pass at that same time, when Gog shall come against the land of Israel, saith the Lord God, that my fury shall come up in my face. For in my jealousy and in the fire of my wrath have I spoken. Now, they were going to head towards Jerusalem, but these things stopped it from happening that I mentioned earlier. For in my jealousy and in the fire of my wrath have I spoken, surely in that day there shall be a great shaking in the land of Israel, so that the fishes of the sea and the fowls of the heaven and the beasts of the field and all creeping things that creep upon the earth and all men that are upon the face of the earth shall shake at my presence, and the mountains shall be thrown down, and the steep places shall fall, and every wall shall fall to the ground. And I will call for a sword against him throughout all my mountains, saith the Lord God. Every man's sword shall be against his brother. So that's because they're all related and they're all descended from Magog, with Gog leading them as the chief. And I will plead against him with pestilence and with blood, and I will rain upon him and upon his bands and upon the many people that are with him, an overflowing rain, great hailstones, fire and brimstone. Thus will I magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations, and they shall know that I am the Lord. So these other nations coming with them are not just, comrades, in the fight. They're actually descendants of Magog, all of them. And wherever they settled and whichever groups they are, they're all descendants and they're all brothers and cousins, and they're all going to come together in the end to try to go against Israel. So it was because of the fact that Berkey's intervention, keeping Hulagu and Inner Mongol disputes going, this is what prevented him from inflicting the sacred lands of Islam, Mecca, Medina, Jerusalem, with the same fate that was suffered in Baghdad. That's where I left off. Berkey's successors, Togarmah, 1282-1287, and Ozbeg, 1312-1341, after whom Uzbekistan is named, also converted to Islam, ensuring that the religion was connected with the very foundation of the Golden Horde. These public and collective conversions were not mere political opportunism, but expressed a new social identity and source of collective solidarity that went beyond the ideological framework of the GHENGISids. In the decades following Berkey's initial conversion, 3 of the 4 Khanats would convert to Islam under their Muslim rulers at one point or another. A direct descendant of Hulagu, Mahmud Ghazan, reigned 1295-1304 of the Ilkhans, was the first to officially declare Islam as the religion of his Khanat. Although Ghazan was continually at odds with Muslim dynasties, his patronage of religious scholarship is well known. Historian Rashid al-Din is just one of the many scholars who flourished under it. Ghazan also earned the good regard of minorities in his kingdom, allowing them to practice their religion freely. The Chagatai Khanat was the third to accept Islam, though it grappled with its identity for some time. Tamashirin Khan, reigned 1331 AD to 1334 AD, became Muslim, much to the chagrin of the Mongol nobles who remained Buddhist and Tigrilist. He was eventually murdered following an accusation that he abandoned the Mongol code of conduct. Only under Tughlu Timur Khan, reigned 1347 to 1360, did Islam have a more permanent presence in the Khanat. Following the conversion of Tughlu himself, and it is claimed that 120,000 Shahdayid Mongols alongside him. Unlike the 3 Western Khanats, the 4th, the Yuan, in modern-day China, did not convert to Islam, remaining primarily Buddhist. Later in the 15th century, another descendant of Genghis Khan and a great-grandson of the Chagatai Muslim ruler Temür Tamerlan would continue the Mongol legacy. Zahir al-Din Babur, 1483-26, founded the Mughal Empire in India, becoming the first emperor of what was to be the last of the world's major Turco-Mongol dynasties. Now here's something else. We know that the early Huns and Mongols were a nomadic Siberian horse-riding peoples who would eventually travel west to conquer, subsequently leaving Asian tribes to populate the region known today as Mongolia. We also know that the Huns became today's Turks, and the Scythians are today's Russians. As noted earlier, these people groups would eventually populate present-day Eurasia, including Russia, Siberia, the numerous republics north of Israel, as precisely described in Ezekiel 38 and 39. Gog and Magog's descendants are today the peoples of those regions. And Ukraine. Recent genetic research shows that many of the great confederations of early Asian steppe war tribes were not entirely of the same race. but rather tended to be ethnic mixtures of the Turkic, Tungus, Mongolian, and in many cases Scythian and Iranian. Note that today more than 90% of these people groups are Muslim. Now this is written as an Islamic historical piece of history. So this website is, that I'm reading, part of their history. In 1346, the Black Death spread to Asia, which was the beginning of the Golden Horde's downfall. Another thing that contributed to their downfall was the murder of Uzbeg Khan's successor. The Russian princes defeated the Horde's general, Memai. Sarai Berk was invaded and destroyed, and most of the Khanat's skilled craftsmen were deported to Central Asia. The Golden Horde was eventually split into several smaller Khanats, some of which included Crimea, Astrakhan, and Kazan. The Golden Horde was this vast area that was invaded, self-designated as Ulug Ulus, literally Great State in Turkic, was originally a Mongol and later Turkicized Khanat, established in the 13th century and originating as the northwestern sector of the Mongol Empire. With the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire after 1259, it became a functionally separate Khanat. It is also known as the Kipchak Khanat or as the Ulus of Jaki. From worldhistory.org, it talks about that the Golden Horde was the European appanage of the Mongol Empire, 1206 to 1368 CE, begun in earnest by Batu Khan in 1227 CE. The territory that would eventually become the Golden Horde came to encompass parts of Central Asia, much of Russia, and other parts of Eastern Europe, later converting to Islam. The Golden Horde would meld aspects of cultures from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East while ruling Russia for over 2 centuries. At its height, Mongol raids from the Golden Horde extended from the Caucasus to Hungary to Constantinople, inspiring fear across the known of the world of the fearsome Mongol horsemen, or as they knew them, the Tartars. They came from the east. It was to fall to Jaki's son Batu Khan to consolidate conquests around the Ural Mountains and beyond and establish the Golden Horde. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan, 1206 to 1227 CE, the Mongol Empire began the greatest military machine of the medieval world, expanding from Korea to the Caspian Sea. Under Genghis's reign, his sons and grandsons would bring the Mongol Empire to its heights, creating the largest continuous land empire the world has ever seen. According to Mongol tradition, Genghis divided his empire into appanages for each of his 4 sons. Genghis's first son, Jaki, received the lands furthest from Mongolia, those around the Ural Mountains. Genghis's son and Batu's uncle ordered a massive Mongol campaign east across the Ural Mountains to conquer Europe. In 1236 CE, the Mongol horde descended into the Volga River Valley. Nothing to stand against Mongol warfare as the Volga Bulgars fell in 1237 CE, followed by the major Russian cities of Vladimir, Suzdal, Kiev, and Halish between 1238 and 1240 CE. Only the city of Novgorod, far to the north, escaped the Mongol onslaught. So they were invaders of Russia in the area of Russia. With Russia vanquished, the Mongol horde marched west. A 3-prong attack led by Batu and the famous Mongol general Subtwai devastated the Polish and Teutonic Knights at the Battle of Legnica in 1241 CE before the main army crushed the Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohi, aka the Battle of the Sojo River. Later that year, and Europe lay bare before the seemingly invincible Mongol horde, but the death of Ogadai back in Mongolia made the Mongols retreat and allowed Europe to breathe a sigh of relief. These first raids led the Europeans to dub the Mongols Tartars, both from the name of the Mongol clan, the Tatars, and fact that they seemingly came from the depths of hell, or Tartarus. So that would mean that all the descendants of Magog seemingly came from the depths of hell, or Tartarus. The Mongols would never venture as far as the Adriatic again, but the Golden Horde would remain a significant presence in Europe for the next 2 centuries by playing the role of kingmaker following the death of Guyuk Khan in 1248 CE. Batu established the permanence of his family's rule over the Golden Horde portion of the Mongol Empire. Batu set up a capital at Sarai near the Volga and introduced a pattern of tribute from the Russian princes. So now, he must have been a Muslim. He was trying to get tribute from the Russian princes that would become a hallmark of the Golden Horde. In fact, one of the potential origins of the name Golden Horde is that the color derived from that of Batu's splendid golden tent. However, the color gold was associated with Genghis' family called the Golden Family, and it was associated with the center in the Mongols' color system for cardinal directions. So those could be potential origins. Batu's brother Berke, 1257 to 1266 CE, continued the precedent of Batu's robust leadership. He led campaigns into Poland, Lithuania, and Prussia, reinforcing the European fear of the Mongols. But perhaps the most important event of Berke's reign was his conversion to Islam. The fact that Berke was a Muslim put him at odds with Hulagu Khan, the leader of the Ilkhanate, which had conquered Iran and Iraq and had become one of the 4 main powers in the Mongol Empire. Hulagu had sacked the great Muslim city of Baghdad in 1258 and had killed the last Abbasid caliph by rolling him in a carpet and trampling him to death. The Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate also bordered each other in the Caucasus, which became a flashpoint. In 1262 CE, war broke out between the 2 nominal parts of the Mongol Empire. Berke formed an alliance with Baybars, the Mamluk Sultan in Egypt. An Ilkhanate invasion of the Golden Horde ended in defeat when the Golden Horde general Nogai led a surprise attack at the Battle of Terek in 1262 CE. At the same time as this Berke-Hulagu war, there was a civil war back in Mongolia over who would become Great Khan. Instead of active military campaigns, Uzbek and his successors kept the Russian princes subservient and divided by playing them against each other. Tver was the leading city backed by the Mongols, but when the city's population slaughtered their Mongol residents in 1327 CE, Uzbek switched his support to the city of Moscow. Uzbek opened up the Crimea to trading posts by the Genoese and Venetians. The 1340 CE featured the last Mongol campaigns into Poland.